All right, welcome everybody to yet another Rising Tide Foundation workshop. Cynthia and I just returned back last week with Quan. We did a little bit of a tour of duty and engaged in some interesting projects in Japan. Before that, Cynthia and I were speaking in Switzerland and Basel at a big event, as well as another thing in Ireland, where many people within a patriotic resistance could smell something similar that they had unfortunately a living memory of, due to the fact that the Irish did suffer a Malthusian population reduction program not that long ago in the form of the what's euphemistically called the potato famine, which really, anybody with half a brain looking at the fact that Ireland was not simply a nation relying purely on potatoes in the 1840s and 50s knows that there was something else going on. There was an abundance of food, of wheat, of livestock. So the fact that there was a potato blight and thus 2 million people died was not an accident. That was a consciously intended outcome, just as we saw applied to the 20 plus famines that were induced artificially over while the British had control of India. Similar thing. So, these people were very, very receptive and sensitive to the revival of these Malthusian ideas in a more modern garb in our modern setting. So that was a really interesting conference that we got to speak at regarding dealing with solutions, understanding the multipolar alliance, what are the actual battles that are waging right now internationally. So it was a really fun experience. And we had a chance while we were gone to listen in as much as we could to the Theaetetus discussions that were recorded that Quan did a great job leading. The last one of which we still have to upload, unfortunately, but that'll be up soon. So Quan and I were just discussing what would be some interesting and lawful pathways coming out of the Theaetetus dialogue on the topic of knowledge. And I'm sure Quan is going to have something to say about what we're going to be reading today. But I just want to, I guess, throw a couple of thoughts out there first. Keeping in mind, this is, like usual, an interactive thing. We're not just reading Plato in order to memorize what he's saying. We're really trying hard to treat this as a piece of theater, which means, as all good drama is concerned, and this is the case with every Platonic dialogue, right? They're written as dialogues to be enacted in a form of a performative principle where you're putting yourself into the mind and shoes of the characters on a stage and thinking through, okay, if I were to be a person who had certain assumptions and felt a certain way about my identity, how would I feel in a journey of exploration to see if my hypothesis about a matter of the soul or of truth were true or false? How would I test my hypothesis? How would I feel if I were to find that maybe there was a problem in an unexamined axiom embedded that I hadn't explored within my thought process? Would I get enraged? Would I be happy? What type of personality would I have to be either one of those two things, enraged or happy or excited? And then see if how could we employ this in our own day-to-day life, right? Obviously, that's always the point of the Platonic dialogues. So this particular one, we could have read a few things first before this, but I think Quan and I we were and Cynthia was also discussing this with us. Like, well, okay, well, if the Theaetetus really dealt with the matter, I mean, it hinges in many ways upon the knowledge of the soul having existence and having a certain quality, such that knowledge could exist. And that knowledge is not something that any machine could do. Like, real knowledge is not simply deductive logic extending itself using reference points of things that are already believed or experienced by the senses. Real knowledge involves, at a certain point, a creative leap, an insight, a leap into, that involves intuition, love, certain subtle emotions that are involved the whole time. So if that were the case, well, we didn't really fully prove that there is such a thing as the soul in the Theaetetus dialogue. It was, but it wasn't in depth. And for me, this is the last day of Socrates' life, right? So everyone, I think, probably has a sense that the Phaedo dialogue occurs the night that Socrates is going to be drinking the hemlock after he was condemned for corrupting the minds of the youth and disproving certain sacred cows of the governing intelligentsia, of the oligarchy of Athens, right? Certain concepts of the polytheistic deities with their characteristics that Socrates, over the course of his very productive life, proved had certain holes and certain contradictions in how we were thinking about that. So, the demos voted democratically to have him killed. And, and this is where I think the founding fathers of America understood that democracy is really just, it's not a virtuous thing to be a pure democracy. That was really understood by John Quincy Adams, by John Adams, by Ben Franklin. If you just read the writings of the Federalist Papers, it was recognized that democracy was really just the flip side of tyranny, just the tyranny of the stupid. Because if people believe that that truth is just what is popularly opinionated, well, that's not really truth. That's just whatever the mass mob believes, which everyone calibrates to, and a mob that thinks that way is easily going to be swayed by demagogues and social engineers. And that's not a new thing. That goes back a long ways, as we could see. So I'm not going to say much more, but Kwan, do you have any thoughts before we jump into this dialogue?
Yeah, maybe I would like 5 to 10 minutes to express what I want about the Phaedo.
Please.
So once again, it's about the famous night or evening of February 14, 399 BCE, when Socrates drank the hemlock. And as I discussed with Matt, rather than going directly to the second of the trilogy, the Sophist, we thought that going by the Phaedo would be more interesting because it would be more organically linked to the Theaetetus than the Sophist. It doesn't mean that we would not tackle with the Sophist later on. In the Theaetetus, I talked with you guys about the 6 layers of the mind. So senses, perception, the intellect, the psyche, for the lower trigram, the lower kingdom. And after that, you have beauty, goodness, and truth. Sure. I would say that even if the Theaetetus by itself, for those who have been there discussing the Theaetetus, cover the 6 layers, it was truly the first 3 layers and a little bit of the 4th, which was directly tackled by the dialogue, the Theaetetus. The Phaedo is the upper part of that psychocosmogram, okay? Because for me, the Theaetetus, the Sophist, the Statesman, and the Phaedo are texts forming what I call a psychocosmogram. Okay, why psychocosmogram? Psycho comes from psyche, which is the name for the 3rd layers of the mind, and cosmos is the name for the 5th layer of the mind. So as long as we are in reason and intellect, it's quite easy to talk about the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, and the 4th, a little bit of the 5th layer of the mind. But with the Phaedo, Socrates is really tackling about the 6th layer of the minds, about being. So you will see that there is a quantum leap here compared to the Theaetetus. Especially once again for those who have participated in the reading of the Theaetetus, it was quite the 1st, and the 2nd, and the 3rd layers who were discussed at length. Okay, if you remember on 100 and some pages. In the Phaedo, okay, maybe the best way to say it is to remind that Socrates has been condemned because he has been considered as having corrupted the youth of Athens and not believing in the gods of Athens. But the true reason why he has been condemned is because he was promoting the philosopher king, meaning precisely what Matt said 5 minutes ago, that he was not in favor of the form of so-called democracy that Athens had at the times, and he favored more a form of government led by people having the epistemological level to be leaders. And the big thing about the Phaedo is you would have four arguments that I'm not going to talk about here because we will read them, explaining on the intellectual level why the soul is there, but I don't think that's the best argument. The best argument is what Socrates has done 24 centuries ago, that while dying, he was proving to the last moment that what remained is awareness. If you, for those who have read the Phaedo before, you remember that he would speak that he still feel his feet, his body, his arms, and so on, till he was no more capable to talk. And that is, for me, the true proof or the true demonstration of the immortality of the soul, even if the intellectual arguments that would be presented here would be interesting to a certain extent, but we will have probably more time to discuss them later on. And I finish here.
Okay. All right, let's get her rolling. Okay, so can people see the screen? Plato's Phaedo, translation by David Horan.
Can I add one note?
Oh, of course.
I think it's interesting that we're starting this on the anniversary of the first human in space.
Ah, that is an excellent observation, John. That's good. Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that very quickly, yeah, this was the idea of uniting or finding the harmony between the finiteness of our mortal lives and the infiniteness of something as big as the divine, the eternal, the infinite. These are seemingly two contradictory concepts, right? What could be more different from the finite than the infinite? How could you reconcile two things that are so contradictory in their nature? And yet here we are 2,400 years ago in the past doing that very thing, as we're going to come to discover. And here we were just, in the midst of the Cold War, when everybody, there's a very, very good reason to feel that maybe we had the power to wipe ourselves out as a species, where a human being began to actually extend humanity's existence into the infiniteness of space. So that's a great parallel, John. Really, really good.
I find it interesting too that amongst the noise of everything going on in the world at the moment, that anniversary's hardly got any publicity at all.
Mm-hmm.
The announcement that there is a 3-man, 1-woman crew being prepared to go back to orbiting the moon got mentioned, but even that hardly got any traction. You're just not seeing a lot of news about that, which kind of weird in its own way, isn't it? The silence on something as big as a return to the moon.
Yeah, well, there's certain interests that would rather us remain in a little tiny cage.
Oh yes,
with no sense of our past or future.
We could speculate on those interests and the why of that forever and ever and ever, Matthew.
Okay, well let's get at something that genuinely scares some of those interests, which is people getting together to read and get to know the mind of Plato or Socrates or both. So we need a couple of volunteers today. We need obviously a Phaedo, a young disciple of Socrates. We need an Echecrates. We need a Socrates. So actually, since Socrates is sort of carrying the heaviest weight here, who would like to take on the soul of Socrates in this discussion, at least for the first part? Everyone's on mute, by the way. Oh, okay, got a Declan there. Okay, Declan Socrates sold. Okay, Phaedo. Who wants to be Phaedo? Phaedo is the person who obviously the dialogue is written after and is going to be the person introducing their memory of what happened on that night to Echecrates. Who wants to know? Who wants to be Phaedo?
I'll be Phaedo.
Okay, John is Phaedo. Echecrates is not going to be in there for long. It's a very short segment. Who wants to be Echecrates? I can't hear anybody. Everyone's on mute. Okay, Robert is Echecrates. Okay. Who else do we have here? For the time being, I feel like that's going to be it for a while. And then when we encounter a new personality, someone will just jump in. Okay. So let's start her off here. Echecrates, this is now a little sometime after Socrates is dead. Echecrates meeting Phaedo. I can make it bigger.
No, it's fine.
Okay. Robert, you're on mute.
Is that better?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I'll start. Were you yourself there with Socrates on the day he drank the poison in the prison? Or, Phaedo, or did you hear about it from someone else?
I was there myself, Echecrates.
Well then, what did the man say before his death, and how did he die? I would love to hear about this. The fact is, no one from Phyllis tends to visit Athens much these days, nor has any visitor come from there for quite a while. Someone who could give us a definite account of those events, apart from saying that he drank the poison and died. They had nothing to say about anything else.
So did you not even find out the details of the way the trial unfolded?
Yes, someone did report these events to us, and we were surprised that, although the trial took place some time ago, he was evidently put to death much more recently. Why did that happen, Phaedo?
In his case, it was the result of a coincidence, Echecrates. It so happened that the prow of the ship which the Athenians sent to Delos was crowned the day before the trial.
And what ship is this?
It is the ship on which, according to the Athenians, Theseus once traveled to Crete, bringing the twice 7 young people, and he saved them and saved himself. Now it is said that they vowed to Apollo there and then to send a sacred expedition to Delos every year if they were saved. Accordingly, every year since then, including this year, they send an expedition to honor the god. Now they have a law that once they begin the expedition, the city is to be kept pure during that period, and no one may be executed by the authorities until the ship has arrived at Delos and returned once more. And on occasion, whenever the winds happen to detain them, this takes a lot of time. The sacred expedition begins once the priest of Apollo crowns the prow of the ship, and this happened, as I said, the day before the trial took place. That is why Socrates had so much time in prison between the trial and his death.
Yes, but what about the circumstances of the actual death, Phaedo? What did people say, and how did they behave? Which of his friends were present with him? Or did the authorities not allow them to be there? And did he die bereft of friends?
Not at all. A number of them were present. Quite a number, in fact.
Then try to account all the details to us clearly as possible, provided you have the time.
Well, I do have the time, and I shall try to give you an account. Yes, indeed, being reminded of Socrates is always the greatest delight of all to me, whether I speak of him myself or hear about him from someone else.
In that case, Phaedo, you have listeners who are like-minded, so try to recount everything as precisely as you can.
Well, I myself had a strange feeling while I was there, for I did not experience the usual pity of someone present at the death of a friend. Indeed, he himself appeared happy to me, Echecrates, both in his manner and in his words. So fearlessly and nobly did he meet his end. I was convinced he was not going to Hades without a divine portion, and, indeed, that he would fare well even when he arrived there, if anyone ever does. These are the reasons I did not feel much of the pity which would seem to be expected of someone on a sad occasion. Nor, again, did I feel the pleasure which is usual when we are engaged in philosophy, and our discussions were indeed of that kind. Instead, I had an utterly unusual feeling, a strange mixture combining pleasure and a like measure of pain, at the realization that Socrates was going to pass away soon. And all those present were in much the same state, laughing at one moment and crying at the next. Apollodorus more than any of us. I presume you know the man and his character.
I do, of course.
Well, he was completely overcome, and I was troubled myself, as were the others.
Who else was present, Phaedo?
Of native Athenians, Apollodorus himself was president, and also Critobulus and his father, along with Hermogenes, Epigenes, Aeschines, and Antisthenes. And there was Cepsippus the Paeanian, Menexenus, and some other Athenians. Plato, I believe, was ill.
Were there any visitors present?
Yes, Simmias of Thebes, Cebes, and Phaedondas. And from Megara, there was Euclides and Tepsium.
What about Cleum Brotus and Aristippus? Were they there?
Actually, they were not. In fact, they were said to have been on Aegina.
And was anyone else there?
I think that is just about everyone who was present.
In that case, will you tell us what discussions took place?
I shall try to recount everything to you from the beginning. Now, I myself and the others had always been in the habit of going to visit Socrates on the previous days, gathering at daybreak at the court where the trial took place, for this was near the prison. Every day we used to wait and converse with one another until the prison was opened, as it did not open early. And once it was open, we would go into Socrates and spend most of the day with him. We actually met earlier that morning because on the previous day, after we left the prison in the evening, we found out that the ship had returned from Delos. So we encouraged one another to get to our usual meeting place as early as possible next morning. When we arrived, the doorkeeper came out as usual to answer us, and he told us to wait and not to go in until he called us. The 11 are unchaining Socrates, he said, and are giving instructions about how he is to die today. Now it did not take him long before he returned and bid us enter. In we went and took in the scene. Socrates, just released from his bonds, and Xanthippe, I am sure you know her, sitting beside him holding his little child. Once Xanthippe saw us, she cried out and said the sort of thing women usually say. "Oh, Socrates, your friends will be speaking to you now for the very last time, and you to them." Then Socrates glanced towards Crito and said, "Have someone take them home, Crito." And some of Crito's people led her away, crying and beating her breast, while Socrates sat up in the bed, bent his leg, rubbed it with his hand, and said as he was rubbing it, "Gentlemen, this thing which people call pleasure seems to be so strange. It is so extraordinarily related to pain, though this appears to be its opposite, for the two tend not to come to a person at the same time. Yet if someone pursues one and obtains it, he is almost always compelled to take the other, as though the two were joined to a single head. And it seems to me," he said, "that if Aesop had thought about this, he would have made up a fable that the god wished to reconcile their strife. But as he was unable to do so, he fastened their heads together, and that is why when one arises in someone, the other also follows after it. It seems that this is just what happened to me. After the pain in my leg on account of the chain, the pleasure now appears to follow."
So now we're shifting gears a little bit now as the drama is taking the stage. You can almost imagine one scene having transformed right into the past, and now we're gonna have the actors speaking in a little bit more with the narrator's voice further in the background. We need a Cebes, who's the friend of Simmias, a young guy who wants to be Cebes. Vince or
I'll put
Brandy?
my hand up for that one, Matthew.
Oh, okay. Paul is Cebes. Okay. Or Cebes.
So Matt, do you want me to, when someone is, when
For now, you're going to be the narrator. So speaking, but then as soon as you see the character kicked in, so you just set the dialogue, and then Cebes starts speaking by Zeus, right?
So I don't speak by the Zeus, it is just as well.
Then
Okay,
Cebes
gotcha.
took this up and said,
Okay, gotcha.
we'll organically just tap into it. You'll see.
Gotcha. Then Cebes took this up and said,
Oh, is that me to read?
Paul,
Oh, okay.
Cebes. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. By Zeus, it is just as well you jog my memory, Socrates. A number of people have been asking me about your compositions, the setting of Aesop's fables to verse and the hymn to Apollo. In fact, Evenus also asked me recently what exactly you had in mind, since you composed these words on arriving in prison, even though you had not composed anything before then. Now, if you would like me to have an answer for Evenus, tell me what I should say whenever he asks me again, for I know very well that he will ask.
Tell him the truth, Cebus, he
He
replied.
replied.
I did not compose these works with view of rivaling him or his poems. No, I knew that would not be easy. Rather, I was testing out the meaning of certain dreams and clearing my conscience in case they were, perhaps, instructing me to make music in the usual sense. Now, the dreams went something like this. The same one often came to me during the course of my life, sometimes in one guise, sometimes in another, but always saying the same thing. Socrates, it said, make music and work at it. On previous occasions, I assumed it was encouraging and exhorting me to do what I was already doing, just as people call upon runners to run. So I thought the dream was exhorting me to do what I was already doing, namely, to make music, since philosophy is the greatest music, and I was already engaged in that. But once the trial was over, and the festival of the god was preventing my execution, it seemed important not to ignore the dream, but to act upon it in case it might, perhaps, be instructing me to make music in the popular sense of the word. Indeed, it seemed safer not to depart until I had cleared my conscience by composing these works in obedience to the dream. So I first composed something for the god whose festival season it was, and after that I realized that a poet needs to compose stories rather than factual accounts if he is actually going to be a poet, and that I myself was no storyteller. So I took whatever stories were to hand, the fables of Aesop, which I know, and turned the first one I came upon into verse. So, Cebes, tell this to Evenus, and bid him farewell, and bid him pursue me as quickly as possible, if he is of sound mind. I'm departing today, it seems, for the people of Athens have given their command.
And Simmias said,
All right, who's Simmias? Vince, Brandy, one of you guys? Helen?
I can be it, but I have a question before.
Oh, hey there, Harold. I didn't see you there. Hey.
It's fine. There's 56 pages. I'm just wondering, what is your plan for covering this in approximately 2 hours? That normally
It won't be. It won't be done in 2 hours. It'll be a couple of weeks.
Okay, so we're just going to do a part of it today.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Just
If
like
you want me to read,
tables.
I can read, Simmias.
Sure.
So do you want me to start from what
and Simmias
instruction?
said,
What an instruction.
What an instruction to give to Evenus, Socrates. I have met the man many times already, and from what I know of him, he will never be persuaded by a request. Not willingly, anyway.
Why not?
he replied.
Is Evenus not a philosopher?
Well, I think he is.
Said Simmias.
Oh,
Then
at this point, John, yeah, I think they're going to be so tiny. Don't worry about it.
Then Evenus will indeed be willing, and so will anyone who engages in this activity in a worthy manner. However, he will not do violence to himself, for this, they say, is not lawful. That's a long one.
Now you can go, John.
And as he was saying this, he placed his feet on the ground and then conducted the rest of the discussion seated in that manner.
And
So
Cebes
Cebes asked him,
asks, Socrates, what do you mean by it is not lawful to do violence to himself, and that a philosopher should be willing to follow someone who is dying?
What is this, Cebes? Have you and Simmias not heard about such matters through your association with Philolaus?
Philolaus.
Philolaus. Not in any detail, Socrates.
Well, I too am recounting what I have heard about these issues. However, I will not begrudge you an account of whatever I happen to have heard, for it is perhaps especially appropriate for someone about to depart to the next world to consider the sojourn there, and tell the stories about what we think it will be like. Indeed, what else could one do until the time when the sun sets?
Socrates, on what precise basis is it said not to be lawful for someone to kill themselves? I have also heard Philolaus saying that you have just said when he was living among us, what you have just said rather, when he was living among us, and I have heard from a number of others since that one should not do this. But I have never yet heard anything in clear concerning these issues from anyone.
Then you should bestir yourself, he said, for perhaps then you will actually hear. However, it may perhaps seem surprising to you that this situation alone, in contrast to all others, admits of no exceptions and is never like the other personal circumstances. Sometimes, for some people, it is better to be dead than to be alive. But if they are better off dead, perhaps it seems surprising to you that it is unholy for those very people themselves to act beneficially towards themselves, rather than waiting for another to perform that service.
Zeus be my witness.
Yes, indeed, said Socrates. It may sound illogical when expressed in that way. However, in spite of that, perhaps it does make some sense. The account about these matters, uttered in secret, declares that we are humans, that we humans are under guardianship, and people should not free themselves from it or run away. This seems important to me, though it is not easy to understand. In any case, Cebes, I do think this is well expressed. The gods are our guardians, and we humans are among the possessions of the gods. Do you not think so?
I do indeed.
Very well then. Well then, if one of your own possessions were to kill itself with no indication from you that you wanted it dead, would you not be angry with it? And would you not punish it if you could do so?
Very much so.
Perhaps then, in this sense, it is not illogical to say that someone should not kill themselves until the gods send some necessity, such as my present predicament.
Well, that appears reasonable anyway. However, when you said just now that the wish to die comes readily to philosophers, that, dear Socrates, sounded strange, especially if what we were saying just now is reasonable, that the god is our guardian and we are his possessions. For it does not make sense for the wisest folk to be untroubled on departing from this care in which the gods, the very best guardians of beings, watch over them. For I presume they will not believe that they will take better care of themselves once they are free. Now, an unreasonable person might think that he should flee from his master, and he would not figure out that one should not flee from the good, but should stay as long as possible. And so he might make an unreasonable escape. However, the reasonable person would presumably desire to be constantly in the presence of someone better than himself. So on this basis, Socrates, the situation is likely to be the opposite of what you just said. It is appropriate for the wise to be troubled at the prospect of death and for the foolish to rejoice. You're
John?
up next, John.
Now I thought
Socrates was pleased with Cebes' analysis, and he looked at us and said,
Cebes is always scrutinizing some argument or other, and is not very willing to be persuaded as soon as someone makes an assertion.
Then Simmias said,
Harinder?
Oh, sorry. Well, on this occasion anyway, I believe that Cebes has a point. But why would people who are truly wise wish to flee from masters who are better than themselves and take their leave of them so readily? And Cebes seems to be directing his argument at you because you are going so readily, leaving us and those good rulers whom you agree are gods.
What you are saying is fair, for I think you mean that I must defend myself against these charges as if I were in a court of law.
Yes, very much so.
Come on, then.
Just to be quick here, does everyone is it very clear the paradox in people's minds and the problem that they're about to embark upon trying to solve?
I can take a shot at it. Socrates says it is on the one hand says it's wrong to die, and he on the other hand he he says he's happy to die. So that's the paradox, I think.
Yeah, and he's encouraging any philosopher, including this particular insecure poet who heard that Socrates is writing some poetry and some music on his last day, who's thinking, am I going to be challenged by my popularity? And this person is undoubtedly very famous, and Socrates is like, yeah, well, encourage him to follow me. He must want to do that if he is a true philosopher, and he is one, is he not? So it creates a nice mental dissonance in people. Like, well, what does that mean? So yeah, okay, that's pretty basic.
Okay. Come on, then, and I shall try to conduct my defense more persuasively in front of you than I did in front of the jurors. Indeed, Simmaeus and Cebes, if I did not believe, firstly, that I would be going to various wise and good gods, and secondly, to men who have died, better men than those who are here, I would be wrong to be untroubled by death. Now, Now, although I am hoping to arrive among good men, please note that I would not assert this very confidently. However, rest assured that if I were to assert anything else of this sort with confidence, I would also say that I am going to gods who are perfectly good masters. So on this basis, I am not so troubled by all this, but am quite hopeful that there is something for those who have died, and, as the ancient saying puts it, at least it is much better for those who are good than for those who are bad.
What now, Socrates? Do you intend to depart keeping this understanding to yourself? Or would you be prepared to share it with us? But it seems to me that this is something good to be shared with us too, and at the same time, it will act as your defense if you persuade us of what you are saying.
In that case, I shall try. But first, I think Crito here wanted to speak a while ago. Let him ask what he wants.
Credo, who wants to be Credo?
I can be Crito.
Do it.
Socrates, it is just that the man who is going to give you the poison has been saying to me for some time that you should be told to converse as little as possible. For he says that people who converse become more heated, and this sort of thing should be avoided before the poison is to be administered. Otherwise, people who do this are sometimes compelled to drink the poison twice or even 3 times.
Do not mind him. Just let him attend to his own duty and give the poison twice, and if necessary, 3 times.
Yes, I was quite sure you would say that, but he has been bothering me about these things for some time.
Let him be. And instead, I want to present an argument to you jurors as to why it seems likely to me that a man who has really spent his life in philosophy is confident when facing death, and is hopeful that he will obtain enormous benefits in the next world once he dies. Of course, Simmaeus and Cebes, I shall now try to explain how this might be the case. For most people are likely to be unaware that those who engage properly in philosophy are themselves in pursuit of nothing except dying and being dead. Now, if this is true, it would surely be strange for someone who is eager all his life for this alone, to be troubled when he actually attained what he had pursued so eagerly for so long.
By Zeus, Socrates, I am not really in laughing humor just now, but you have made me laugh. Yes, I believe that most people on hearing this would think you have made a very good point about philosophers, and our own people would agree emphatically that those who engage in philosophy really do have a longing for death, and that this is the fate they deserve to suffer. They're quite aware of that.
And in a sense, Simmaeus, what they are saying would be true, except for their claim that they are aware, for they are unaware of the way in which true philosophers desire death, or the sense in which they deserve to die, or what kind of death it is. Indeed, we should just speak among ourselves, and bid farewell to those fellows. Do we think that death is something?
Very much so.
Is it anything other than the separation of the soul from the body? And is this what it is to be dead? The body is separate from the soul and is just by itself, while the soul, having been separated from the body, is just by itself. Is death anything other than this?
It is nothing but this.
Now, good man, consider whether your views are the same as mine. Indeed, from these I believe we shall come to know more about the issue we are investigating. Does it appear to you that a person who loves wisdom would be serious about such so-called pleasures as eating and drinking?
Not in the least, Socrates.
What about sexual pleasures?
Not at all.
And what about the other indulgences associated with the body? Do you think people of this sort would regard them as valuable? I mean, would they value the acquisition of distinctive clothing or shoes and other adornments of the body? Or do you think that they would disregard them and partake of them only to the extent really necessary?
I think the true philosopher would disregard them.
Don't you think, in general, that the preoccupation of such a person is not about the body, but is directed away from it as much as possible and turned toward the soul?
I do indeed.
So it is obvious in the first place that in such matters the philosopher exceeds all others in freeing the soul as much as possible from communion with the body.
So it appears.
And it seems to most people, I presume, Simmias, that someone to whom nothing of this sort is pleasant, and who does not partake thereof, does not deserve to be alive, and that a person who thinks nothing of the pleasures which derive from the body is well nigh dead.
Yes, what you are saying is certainly true.
But what about the acquisition of wisdom itself? Is the body an impediment or not? If it is brought along to assist it in the search. My question goes something like this. Do sight and hearing afford men any truth? Or is there truth in the sort of things even the poets are constantly repeating to us, that we neither see nor hear anything accurately? And indeed, if these two bodily senses are neither accurate nor clear, it would be idle to consider the others, for they are all somehow inferior to these two. Or doesn't it seem so to you?
It does seem so to me.
So when does the soul encounter the truth? For whenever it attempts to contemplate anything in conjunction with the body, in that case it is obviously deceived by the body.
What you say is true.
Well, isn't it in reasoning rather than anywhere else that any of the things that are become obvious to it? Sorry.
Yes.
But presumably, then, the soul reasons most beautifully whenever nothing else bothers it, neither hearing, nor sight, nor pain, nor any pleasure, and it is itself by itself to the greatest extent possible, bids the body farewell, and bids the body farewell, has as little communion and contact with it as it can, and reaches toward what is.
This is so.
Then is it here too that the soul of the philosopher shows most disregard for the body, flees from it, and strives to be itself and by itself?
So it appears.
But Simmias, what about this? Do we say that there is something just itself, or nothing is?
By Zeus, we do indeed say that there is.
And something is beautiful and is itself good.
How could there not be?
Now, have you ever seen anything of this kind with your eyes?
Not at all.
But have you ever contacted them through the body by means of any other sense? I am referring to all of them, for example, size, health, strength, and all the others. In short, I am speaking of the being of them all, which each of them happens to be. Can the very truth of them be contemplated by the means of the body? Or is it the case that whoever is best and most diligently prepared to understand each of these in itself is the person who will come closest to the knowledge of them?
Yes, certainly.
Now, wouldn't a person undertake this with the utmost purity if he were to make his approach to each of them with the mind alone in the greatest possible extent, without introducing sight into the mental activity, or dragging in any other sense perception whatsoever along with the reasoning, but making use of the mind just by itself, without admixture? Wouldn't he take up the hunt for each of the things that are, as freely as possible from the eyes and ears, and, in effect, from all that is bodily? For this disturbs the soul and does not allow it to acquire truth and wisdom whenever it communes with the body. Won't this person, Simmias, and no other, attain what is?
Socrates, what you are saying is extraordinarily true.
Then, the genuine philosophers must form a particular opinion based on these conclusions, so that they say something of this sort to one another. Yes, a sort of narrow path seems to be leading us on to side with reason in the inquiry, because as long as we have the body and our souls compounded with such badness, we shall never satisfactorily obtain what we desire. And this, we say, is the truth. Indeed, the body brings countless distractions upon us just because it needs sustenance. What is more, if any illness befalls it, they impede our hunt for what is. And the body also fills us with loves, desires, fears, a whole range of imaginings, and a lot of foolishness, so that, as they say, and it really is true, we never ever acquire any wisdom at all through its agency. And in fact, it is only the body and its desires which bring about wars, insurrections, and fighting. For all wars arise on account of the possession of wealth, and we are compelled to acquire wealth because of the body, as we are slaves in its service. And because of all these factors, we become too busy to engage in philosophy. Worst of all, even if we do get time, free from its demands, and turn towards some philosophic inquiry, the body keeps intruding into the inquiry in all sorts of ways, bringing tribulation and agitation, and confounding us so that we are unable to see truth clearly because of it. But, in fact, this argument has shown us that if we are ever going to have pure knowledge of anything, we must be quit of the body and behold the objects themselves with the soul itself. We claim to be lovers of wisdom, and we shall obtain what we desire and what we claim to love when we die, as the argument indicates, but not while we are alive. Indeed, if it is impossible to know anything purely whilst accompanied by the body, there are two possibilities. Either it is impossible to acquire the knowledge at all, or it happens after death, for then, and not until then, will the soul be itself by itself, separate from the body. And while we are living in the body, in this way we shall, it seems, be closest to acquiring knowledge when we have the least interaction or communion with it, only what is absolutely necessary, and are not contaminated with its nature, but purify ourselves from it, until God himself releases us. And in this way, being pure and liberated from the foolishness of the body, we are likely to be with those who are like us, and we shall know all that is pure through ourselves alone. And this, I dare say, is the truth, that the impure has no contact with the pure, for that would not be lawful. Wait, is that me again? Oh,
Yeah, it's
Yep.
you.
I believe, Simmias, that this is the sort of thing which all those with a proper love of learning will think and say to each other. Is that how it seems to you?
More than anything, Socrates.
Therefore, if this
I just
is
want
all
to point one
Yeah.
little thing out here that's interesting, and this is always very useful to hold in mind when reading Plato. Is he's teasing you, right? A lot of people, they treat Plato like he has no personality or playfulness. He's a very playful character. And if you keep in mind, he just said something in the course of this. He said a lot of things, but the one thing that caught me is he says the impure has no contact with the pure. That would not be lawful. Does somebody see possibly a little connection to something he noted almost as a throwaway at the very beginning when he observed when his shackles were coming off of Socrates's legs, as he noticed, it feels itchy to scratch. But isn't it interesting that pleasure and pain kind of tend to always coexist? Because there's a pain with scratching, but there's a pleasure. And a pleasure would be something kind of you would associate with more pure than a pain, which would be more impure, you'd think. But he's sort of planting a sort of clue as well. Nothing that tends to happen is for no reason in these dialogues.
Well, I think, Matthew, if I can just interject, I think he is saying that he's pointing out the problem with the body, that you cannot have pure pleasure without pain being attached to it as the flip side of the coin. And which is why the true philosopher is always seeking liberation from the body, to be rid of the flip side, because you can never get true joy in the body without also getting the whole bunch of pain. I think that was his point there. And on this last line that you had just quoted, another translation I had read said, for the impure, it cannot be allowed to approach the pure. So that's a slightly different nuance. He says this would be not lawful. I guess that's just another way of saying the impure cannot be allowed to approach the pure.
Yeah. And there are a lot of these examples of contradictions that, like the finite and the infinite. We are finite people, he's finite, but what we're trying to be doing right now in the course of these dialogues is approach an understanding of concepts that have no boundaries, that are infinite in their essence. So there's all of these playful ways of getting people to break free or be liberated from their naive logic, which presumes these absolute dichotomies as well.
But I think Matthew, I'll just make a quick point. The thing that he has not defined yet, what is the thing that the philosopher is seeking, is whether it's beauty or wisdom, it's the immortal. And he hasn't defined it yet. He goes ahead in the future. In the future. Yeah. Yep. Sorry. Okay, I'll stop.
Yep, you're right.
Okay. Therefore, said Socrates, if this is all true, my friend, there is great hope that when someone arrives where I am going, there, if anywhere, they fully attain that objective which has given rise to so much endeavor in our lives so far. So this departure, which is now forced upon me, offers good hope for any man who believes he has prepared his mind, which has, in a sense, been purified.
Yes, certainly.
But does not this purification turn out to be just what we said it was in the earlier discussion, the separation of the soul from body to the greatest extent possible, getting soul accustomed to gathering itself together and collecting itself from all parts of the body to dwell itself by itself as best it can, both in its present situation and hereafter, being set free from the body as though from bonds?
Yes, certainly.
And isn't this how death is described, a freeing and separation of soul from body?
Entirely so.
And we are saying that it is only those who engage in philosophy correctly who are always most eager to free the soul. This is the particular practice of the philosophers, the freeing and separating of soul from body. Is this so?
So it appears.
So, as I said in the beginning, it would be ridiculous for a man who prepares himself throughout life by being as close to death as possible, and who lives accordingly, to be troubled at the arrival of his own death.
Ridiculous, of course.
So, in fact, Simmias, he said, those who engage properly in philosophy practice dying, and of all people, death is least fearful to them. Reflect upon this. If they are indeed at variance with the body in every way, and they wish to have the soul just by itself, but they are fearful and troubled when this happens. Wouldn't they not? Wouldn't that be? Wouldn't that be very irrational? Shouldn't they be glad to go to a place where there is hope that those who arrive there, free from association from their former adversary, will attain that which they have loved throughout their lives, and what they have loved is wisdom. When humans loved ones, wives or sons, have died, many people have been prepared to go after them willingly to Hades, led by the hope of seeing their loved ones and of being with them there. So if someone actually loves wisdom and has a firm hold of this same hope that he will attain no wisdom worthy of mentioning anywhere else but in Hades, will he be troubled when he is dying? Wouldn't he be glad to go there? Surely he must think so, my friend, if he is in fact a philosopher, for he will hold strongly to the view that there, and nowhere else, will he attain wisdom in its purity. And if this is the case, then as we said before, it would be highly irrational for such a person to fear death.
Very much so, by Zeus.
Therefore, do you have sufficient evidence that a man whom you see grieving when he is going to die is no lover of wisdom, but a lover of the body? The same person also turns out to be a money lover, or a lover of honor, one or the other, or both.
Indeed, the situation is just as you described.
Well, Simmias, doesn't what we refer to as courage belong mainly to those with a philosophic disposition?
Entirely so.
And sound-mindedness, too. Sound-mindedness is, as most people describe it, not being aroused in the fact of desires, but being frugal and orderly. Doesn't this belong only to those who show the least regard for the body and spend their lives in philosophy?
It must.
Now, if you wish to consider the courage and sound-mindedness of other people, it would seem unusual to you.
In what way, Socrates?
You know that everyone else who regards death as one of the great evils,
Very much so.
and don't the courageous among them submit to death whenever they do so from fear of greater evils?
That is what happens.
So apart from the philosophers, everyone is courageous due to fear and terror. However, it is quite illogical to be courageous due to terror and cowardice.
It certainly is.
And what about those among them who are orderly? Aren't they in the same predicament, namely that they are sound-minded due to a certain lack of restraint? Indeed, as we say that this is impossible, but nevertheless, this is what their foolish sound-mindedness turns out to be like. They are afraid of being deprived of certain pleasures, so, out of desire for these pleasures, they refrain from other pleasures because they are controlled by these pleasures. However, being ruled by pleasures is what they call lack of restraint. But it now turns out that they control pleasures because they themselves are controlled by other pleasures. This is like what was just referred to. They are, in a way, sound-minded due to lack of restraint.
So it seems.
Do people
Thus,
do people follow what he's saying just there? He says that certain people are courageous because they're governed by fears or something very negative, or certain people have temperance, but not because they love temperance, but rather for lowlier reasons. Do people have examples of what he might be talking about?
Well, for one example might be somebody who is a sexual prude. This is going, older times. Not so much because they genuinely are continent, but because they're afraid of social humiliation.
Right.
But
Yeah.
then I don't know if this quite relates, but I thought in the previous paragraph where he was talking about how it would be illogical to be courageous due to terror or cowardice. That I was trying to think of that didn't that sounded it didn't sound right at first. I didn't. How can you be how can it be illogical to be courageous because of cowardice? But then you think that those are contradictory terms, and that's what and made me think of what you were saying, Matt, about the pain and pleasure.
Mhm.
Again, a good and a bad. And so now he's saying that a bad cowardice cannot cause a good courage. You know what I mean?
Do you have an example of somebody who might do something courageously, but for the reason of cowardice of something else or fear of something?
Well, the classic one is you're with us or against us. Oh no, actually that's a little more complicated. But the coward being a bully being a coward, basically. That's one example of such.
A bully, you're saying, looks courageous because they're standing up to people.
Well,
But
it's
they're actually
motivated,
afraid of those people in some ways, is what you're trying to say?
possibly, or that's right. Bullies are said to be cowards in secret kind of thing. So they're compensating or something.
Okay. You
I
like
think
that
it-
one, Declan, or would you think of another one?
I wasn't really thinking. I was thinking of not examples of that in particular, but trying to channel it in a give like different definitions. So being happy because you are sad, or a positive because of a negative. And I don't know if it's the same thing, but that's what made me think of trying to understand what he was saying about courageous and cowardice. Made me think of what you said about pain and pleasure.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, maybe it's just a dead end, but that's what I thought of.
Oh, there's never a dead end in this sort of thing. But I think
No.
what Harinder.
You seem to have the answer, Matthew. So why don't you give it? Better
No,
one.
Yes. No, but I would like to suggest something.
Yeah, go on.
When you use a pleasure against another pleasure, for example, you don't want to eat because you want to have the pleasure to be slim, for example. Okay, you use the same level of energy, meaning you use the level of sense perception and intellect. So it goes back to the fact that true knowledge is difficult. Okay, and true knowledge here is not about information or about structure of organization. Knowledge here is about to be rooted in being, in awareness, and that is the knowledge that is truly difficult. And as long as you're not rooted in that knowledge, or I would say knowledge awareness, so there will be no confusion, you will always be the victim of mind games, either the mind games within your own mind from the past or the mind games because of interaction with others. And there are plenty of example, okay? But a little simplistic example I gave is if you want to have the pleasure to be slim, but why do you want to have the pleasure to be slim? Of course, you feel better when you are slim, but there's also the social image. So there's your mind games, but your mind games is coming from the mind games of others too. So there is a kind of personal prison, but also social prison. Okay, so that's why I go back to what Socrates said at page 9 or 7. I don't remember. I think it's rather 9. Is that freeing and separation of soul from body? It's page 9. Is the task of the philosopher, meaning that you have to be rooted in that true knowledge. It doesn't mean that you reject the body, okay? But you being in the higher awareness, and from that higher awareness, you act with your body. And that is freeing or separation of soul from body. And one of the practical consequence of that is that you know how to die, because the only way to know how to die is to know how to live. That is the exercise during your life of freeing the soul from the body, that you wouldn't be capable to free the soul from the body at the moment of death.
But I think Kwan, he goes beyond that. He says the philosopher is basically seeking to live as if he is a dead person, the entire life, as if he is dead, in the sense that the attractions of the body are not of interest to him because they interfere with the ability to be in touch with the soul.
I agree with you. But for doing so, you need to be rooted in your being first, don't you think?
There is a point there, of course. Yeah, I won't disagree with that. Yeah.
Yes, and that is the philosophical path, because what you said is the goal, of course, but unless you're born naturally like that, I'm willing to accept that some people are born naturally like that. But if you're not born naturally like that, there is a way to travel to reach to that separation of soul and body. But separation of soul and body maybe, okay, and here is my own bias, is maybe a clumsy expression. I would say rooted in being, or rooted in awareness, but maybe it's only a personal preference.
If you connect it to scripture, Kwan, the scripture, it just says basically, as long as you're as long as you have desire, or to use the idea that Buddha has left, that desires cause suffering because the desires are connected to the body and they will bring us back here. We cannot be liberated until the mind has completely freed itself from desire for the body and its pains and pleasures, and wants only what Socrates calls true beauty, true wisdom, etc., which he later on in the dialogue describes as being achievable through the eye of the mind, which looks inward.
Yes, which look inward, yes. But if you're truly inward, you're not afraid to be in the phenomenal reality, right?
Yes, they will not be afraid. Yeah.
Yeah, that's I think the key.
When we were, one thing he did mention so far in this dialogue is, like, we were born, like he's talking about death, but we were also born. I'm like, we had a soul, came into a body. I'm sure there's a reason for that. I'm guessing the reason we're to experience something with the body in this, what we call the real world, or world of material. And I don't know, something like about a purification maybe of that soul using this experience.
I wouldn't get ahead of ourselves right now, Kelly, because that is the purpose of the dialogue, is to explore that very question. But I just want to make sure that people are, and it's good that these little segues happen to just flesh out some ideas. This is a very good thing to do, and everybody should feel free at any time to just jump in with a question if they want something fleshed out or to be discussed. But I think this idea of how if we're always seeking the essence of true being as truth lovers, right? Truth is not something we find as established in the material domain of the senses, where everything is in a state of flux, in the world of the becoming. Being is something which is transcendental to that, and we see its shadows. But if we really care about ideas in a pure sense, like courage in its pure form, temperance, the virtues in their pure form, then in our hearts, if we're animated by vice, the opposite, as we express a virtue, temperance, withholding of our desires in order to attain something, or courage to go over, leap over our fears to do something courageous. If it's being animated by its opposite, well, it's impure in an unlawful way, right? So if you're afraid of being punished if you don't go into battle, right? Or if you're afraid of being dishonored, or you want fame by doing something courageous, well, these are very, again, very impure motives to do something pure. But the philosopher is not somebody, who generally would be like Martin Luther King said, the means must flow through the ends. You can't justify, if you want to do evil to justify good, as Hitler, Napoleon, or any tyrant has always done, right? We want the greater good, and thus we have to do evil. Well, then you're destroying the virtue that you're the ends that you're trying to bring about. But the true good, right, end finds means that are also good. So you have to have a consistency there, but that requires a lot of it's not easy. It requires somebody who has to really think that through for that to make better sense. So I like this, this idea of the contradictions and how.
I'll just add a point to Kwan's point. I think he's absolutely right that until we have achieved a certain amount of discipline in the physical body also, you cannot look to completely disassociate from it. So I find myself now agreeing with what Kwan said also just a few minutes ago.
Cool.
Okay, where were we? We were at bless you, Simius.
So it seems, I think.
Okay. Bless you, Simius. I suspect that when it comes to excellence, this trading is not right. Exchanging pleasures for pleasures, pains for pains, fear for fear, and greater for less as if they were coins. No, there is only one proper coin for which all these must be exchanged, and that is wisdom. And everything should really be bought and sold for this and in conjunction with this. And courage, sound-mindedness, justice, and in short, true excellence should accompany wisdom, whether pleasures, fears, and everything else of that sort should be present or absent. But if these are exchanged for one another, unaccompanied by wisdom, won't such excellence be a shadowy image, which is actually slavish and devoid of anything sound or true? But the true is in fact a purification from everything of that sort, and sound-mindedness, justice, courage, and wisdom itself are purifications. And it seems that those who established our mysteries were not ordinary folk, but in fact they said long ago, in riddling language, that whoever arrives in Hades uninitiated and imperfect will lie in the mire, while someone who has been purified and perfected when he arrives there will dwell with the gods. For as they say in the mysteries, the thyrsus bearers are many, but the Bacchae are few. That's strangely familiar from the Bible. And the Bacchae are, in my view, none other than those who have properly engaged in philosophy. And so throughout my life, unstingingly, and to the best of my ability.
When you said that it reminds you of the Bible, is that many are called, few answer, or something else?
I was thinking about the harvest. The harvest is plentiful, for the laborers are few.
Mm.
Is what popped into my mind.
Yeah.
That was kind of interesting. Okay. But whether I've been eager in the right way, and whether we have achieved anything, that I shall know for certain quite soon when I arrive there, if it be God's will. That is how it seems to me. Now, Simius and Thebes. Thus do I make my case, that it is reasonable to bear without difficulty or tribulation my departure from yourselves and the rulers of this place. For I believe that I shall encounter rulers there who are just as good as these, and companions too. So, if I am any more persuasive toward you with this defense than I was to the Athenian jurors, all would be well.
Once
Socrates,
had
it
said
seems
all
to
this,
me,
Cebes responded by saying,
Socrates, it seems to me at least that in general, what you have said is excellent. But what you said about the soul brings up a lot of doubt in people, lest it may no longer be anywhere once it is quit of the body. They believe that it is destroyed and perishes on the very day a person dies. As soon as it is separated from the body and going forth, dispersed like breath or smoke, it takes flight, is gone, and is no longer anywhere at all. However, if the soul were, in fact, itself by itself, gathered together, freed from those evils you described just now, there would be a great and beautiful hope, Socrates, that what you are saying is true, but it will probably require no small amount of gentle persuasion to prove that after the person dies, the soul exists and possesses some power and wisdom.
What you are saying is true, Cebes. But what are we to do? Would you like us to converse about this very topic, on the question of whether there is likely to be This is likely to be the case or not?
I, for my part, would be glad to hear what opinion you hold on these issues.
Well, I do not think anyone who heard us now, even if he were a comic poet, would say that I am being verbose, that I am constructing arguments which are of no relevance. So if you see fit, we should examine the matter in detail. Let us consider whether the souls of people who have died are in Hades or not, in the following manner. There is an ancient story which we remember, that the souls exist in the other that the souls exist in the other world, having arrived there from this world, and they arrive back here again, coming into being from those who have died. Now, if this is the case, that the living come into being from those who have died, must not our souls be there? For they could not come into being again if they were not there. And if it actually becomes evident that the living come into being from nothing else than from those who have died, this constitutes an adequate proof that these things are so. But if this is not the case, another argument would be required.
Yes, certainly.
Then if you wish to understand this more easily, do not consider human beings alone, but all animals and plants, and in short, anything which comes to be. Let us see whether any of them which happen to have an opposite come into being from those opposites. Beauty is presumably opposite to ugliness, just is opposite to unjust, and there are thousands more examples. So let us consider this, whether anything which has an opposite must come into being from nothing else but its own opposite. For instance, whenever something becomes greater, presumably it must have been lesser before and became greater afterwards.
Yes.
And if it becomes lesser, does it not become lesser, having previously been greater?
That is so.
And indeed, from the stronger comes the weaker, and from the slower, the quicker.
Yes, certainly.
And what about this? Doesn't worse come into being from better, and the more just from the more unjust?
How could it be otherwise?
Do we understand this sufficiently now, that everything comes into being in this way, opposite things arising from opposites?
Yes, certainly.
What about this further question? Is there something of this sort, something in between all these pairs of opposites, which is twofold? Are there two processes, one for going from one extreme to the other, and the second from going in the opposite direction? For there is increase and decrease in between something greater and something lesser, and accordingly, if we refer to one as increasing and the other as decreasing.
Yes.
Doesn't this happen in all cases, separation and combination, cooling and heating? And even if we sometimes do not use the names, must it not, in fact, always be like this, that they are generated from one another, and there is generation into one another?
Yes, certainly.
What about this? Is there an opposite of being alive, just as being awake is the opposite of being asleep?
There is, of course.
What is it?
Being dead.
Don't these come into being from one another, since they are opposites? And as there are two of them, aren't there two processes in between them?
There must be.
Then I shall describe to you one pairing, which we just referred to, and its opposite and its processes too, and you shall then describe the other one to me. So I say that there is being asleep and being awake, and from being asleep arises being awake, and from being awake arises being asleep. And the processes in between the two are falling asleep and waking up. Is that enough for you, or not?
It is certainly enough.
Then describe life and death to me on this basis. Don't you say that being alive is the opposite of being dead?
I do indeed.
And do they arise from one another?
Yes.
Then what is generated from the living?
The dead.
And what is generated from the dead?
I have to admit that it is the living.
So, Siebes, Do those who are alive and anything that is alive come into being from those who have died?
It appears so.
So in Hades, our souls are.
So it seems.
Now, if the two processes involved here, of the two processes involved here, one at any rate is evident, for dying is surely an evident process. Is this so?
Yes, certainly.
Well, how shall we proceed? If we do not balance this with an opposite process, then won't nature be one-legged in this respect? Isn't it necessary to assign some process which is the opposite of dying?
Absolutely.
What process is this?
Coming to life again.
Now, if there is such a thing as coming to life again, would not the coming to life again be the generation of those who are alive from those who have died?
Certainly.
So we agree that the living come into being from the dead in this way, just as much as the dead come from the living. And since this is the case, it seems there is sufficient proof that the souls of the dead necessarily exist somewhere, and that they come into being once more from there.
It seems to me, Socrates, that based upon what has been agreed, this must be the case.
Well, if you look at it this way, I think you will see that what we have agreed is right. For if the various processes did not always correspond to one another, as if they were going around in a circle, but the generation was always in a straight line, only from something to its opposite, and it never turned back into the other again, or went in the other direction, you know that everything would finally have the same form, suffer the same fate, and would stop coming into being.
What do you mean?
It is not difficult to understand what I mean. For instance, if there were a process of falling asleep, on the one hand, without any corresponding process of awaking from sleep, you know everything would eventually make an endemion look significant, and his great sleep would be of no account because everyone else would be the same as him, asleep. And if everything were combined and nothing was separated, the statement of Anaxagoras, that all things were together, would soon be fulfilled. By the same argument, dear Cebes, if everything which ever partakes of life were to die, and the dead were to remain in that condition once they had died without coming back to life again, isn't it totally inevitable that eventually everything would be dead, nothing would be alive? For if the living were to come into being from other sources, and the living, for their part, were to die, is there any way to avoid everything being consumed by death?
I do not think so at all, Socrates. Yet it seems to me that what you are saying is entirely true.
Yes, Cebes. That is how it seems to me. It is truer than any account, and we are not deceived when we agree with all this. Yes, there is in fact always a process of coming back to life again. The living do come into being from those who have died, and the souls of those who have died exist.
And indeed, if that argument, Socrates, which you're in the habit of recounting so frequently, is true, then according to that, learning for us is nothing other than recollection. And on this basis, we must presumably have learned at some previous time what we are now remembering. But this would be impossible unless our soul was somewhere before it took on this human form. So in this way, too, the soul seems to be something immortal.
Simmias?
Thebes, what proofs do we have for these claims? Please remind me, for I do not remember them very well at present.
Well, one excellent argument is this. If people ask questions and someone questions them properly, the people of themselves describe everything as it is. However, if knowledge and a correct account were not within them, they would not have been able to do this. What is more, if someone shows them diagrams or the like, you have the clearest evidence that this is the case.
And, as you are not quite persuaded by this, Simmias, let us see whether you will agree if you consider it as follows. Do you actually doubt that what we call learning is recollection?
I do not doubt it, but I want to undergo the very process the argument is describing. I want to be reminded. From Sebes' attempt at the argument, I almost remember it already, and I am persuaded. Nevertheless, I would now like to hear how you propose to deal with it.
It goes like this. We agree, of course, that if someone is to be reminded of something, he must have known that very thing on a previous occasion.
Certainly.
Now, do we also agree that whenever knowledge arises in a particular manner, it is recollection? What manner am I referring to? Well, if someone, having seen something or heard it or acquired some other perception of it, were to know not only that thing, but if he also thought of something else, something the knowledge of which was not the same but different, would we be right to say that he recollected whatever it was that he thought of?
What do you mean?
Something like this. Presumably, the knowledge of man and of liar are different.
How could they not be?
You know that whenever lovers see a lyre or a garment or anything else which a favorite was in the habit of using, their experience is as follows. They recognize the lyre, and they apprehend in their mind the figure of the boy who owns the lyre, and this is recollection, as when someone who has seen Simmias is often reminded of Sebes, and presumably there would be thousands of other examples of that sort.
Yes, by Zeus. Thousands.
Isn't that sort of thing a recollection, particularly when the experience relates to things which have already been forgotten through time and lack of consideration?
Yes, certainly.
What about this? Isn't it possible to be reminded of a man on seeing a picture of a horse or a picture of a lyre, or to be reminded of Sebes on seeing a picture of Simmias?
Very much so.
And isn't it possible to be reminded of Simmias on seeing a picture of Simmias?
It is indeed.
So doesn't it follow from all this that there is recollection arising from likes, but also from unlikes?
It follows.
But whenever someone recollects anything from like things, isn't there something else that must occur to him? Won't he recognize whether or not the thing lacks anything in respect to its likeness or whatever he is recollecting?
He must.
Well, consider if this is how these matters stand. Well, we say, I presume, that there is something equal, not of wood to wood, or stone to stone, or anything else of that sort, but the equal itself, something different besides all these. May we say that there is such a thing or not?
Indeed, let us say most certainly that there is. It is amazing, by Zeus.
And do we know what it is?
Certainly.
From where did we obtain the knowledge of this? Isn't it as we just said? From seeing pieces of wood or stones or other equals, we have brought that equal to mind from these, and that is different from these. Or does it not appear different to you? Think about this too, as follows. Do not equal pieces of wood and stone, being the same, sometimes appear equal to one thing but not to another?
Yes.
What about this? Did the equals themselves ever appear unequal to you, or equality to be inequality?
Not yet, anyway, Socrates.
Then these equals and the equal itself are not the same.
Not at all, Socrates, not according to me.
And yet, from these equals, which are different from that equal, the knowledge of equality has nevertheless come into your mind and been apprehended.
What you say is very true.
Isn't it either like them or unlike them?
Certainly.
But that makes no difference. As long as you see one thing and bring something else to mind from this observation, be it like or unlike, recollection must have taken place.
Yes, certainly.
What about this? Is our experience somewhere as follows in relation to what is in the pieces of wood or the equals we mentioned just now? Do they appear just as equal to us as the equal just by itself? Or do they lack something that, on account of being something that is like the equal? Or do they lack nothing?
They are considerably lacking.
Do we not agree that whenever someone sees something and thinks, what I now see is aiming to be like something else among things that are, however, it lacks something and is unable to be quite like that. Instead, it is inferior. Presumably, someone who recognizes this must have had prior knowledge of that which he says has come to resemble it has come to resemble, and of which it is falling short.
He must.
Well now, is this also our experience in relation to the equals and the equal itself, or is it not?
Entirely so.
Then we must have had prior knowledge of the equal before that occasion, when we first saw the equals and realized that these are striving to be like the equal, but attain it in a deficient manner.
This is so.
But then, do we also agree that it is recognized, and can only be recognized from seeing, touching, or one of the other senses? Am I saying that these are all the same?
I am saying.
Yes, Socrates, they are the same in the context of what this argument is trying to show.
Well, in any event, we must have recognized from sense perceptions that all perceptible equals are striving toward what equal is, and are deficient with respect to it. Or how would we express this?
In that way.
Then, before we began to see and hear and use the other senses, I presume we must have acquired knowledge of what the equal itself is. If we are to prefer the equals perceived through the senses to that equal, and recognize that everything of this sort endeavors to be like that, but is inferior to it.
That must follow from what we said before, Socrates.
Did we
People can, by the
see?
way,
What?
people can always jump in if you feel like you're losing the train of thought.
Actually, being simious, I have lost the subtle points of the various equals. So I wouldn't mind if you took a segue and summarized it as you understand it.
Sure. Does somebody else want to give it a shot first before I do that? Any volunteers? Well, this question of equal, to keep it a simpler
Maybe a
question, do we
short
know why
comment?
the idea of equality is being addressed and how he's playing with this idea to get across a point of recollection in the soul?
Okay.
Go ahead, Quan.
Oh, my internet is unstable.
Here, he was speaking of a lot of empirical knowledge, okay? But the idea at the back of that is the concept of recollection of non-empirical prior knowledge. That would be one of his arguments for the existence of the soul, because the 3 or 2 pages just before was based on the argument of the opposites concerning the cycles of birth and return of the soul. And after the 2 last pages were about precisely a more primitive form of the theory of forms than the one that has been exposed more in detail in the Republic or in the Meno.
Mm-hmm.
He's talking about an equal that seems to me to be an ideal, and then he compares it with other equals and discusses equality and inequality, and I kind of missed that whole point.
Yeah, maybe the 2 lines that can be useful is, well, in any event, we must have recognized from senses perceptions that all perceptible equals are striving towards what equals is and are deficient with respect to it. Okay. And I don't like to use the following example because I'm not a fan of Immanuel Kant, but it refers exactly to what Kant called the a priori category of perception, meaning there is something at the background that makes you capable to have a judgment on phenomenal reality.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly it. That there's something innate that allows for the judgment. Because the question is always how does our mind pass judgment upon the senses, right? That's partially what we're dealing with. And I've got two pens here, right? And these two pens are they're pretty similar, right?
Seem to
And
be.
one, but these two pens are probably more equal than this fork in this pen, right?
Yeah.
And this fork is probably more equal to this pen than, let's say, this bowl and this pen, right? So I've got more and less equal. This is probably the most equal, right? These two blue pens, but they're still not the same. They're not equal. They could always be made more equal because they're material, they have a material expression. They're not the same. So what is that allows me to pass judgment over the more and the less equal, right? I must have some idea of equality. Now, as closely similar as these two things might become, they will never become purely equal in its pure sense. There will always be an impurity in the physical expression, so that the existence of that pure equality must be inside me somewhere, such that my mind can pass judgment on the information from my senses that discerns more and less equalness. And keep in mind, he's getting at the question of the soul, because they're saying like, oh, but isn't this whole idea contingent of essence of the, because we're dealing with the fear of, is the soul something which perishes with the body, or is there evidence that the soul is something which has power and wisdom beyond the limits of the body in space and time, right? Can we pursue that through reason? Those are the two questions. Because or is there no soul? They didn't address that, but let's throw that out there for the nihilists listening on YouTube, right? Or is there just no soul? That's the third option. And then the question of, well, the famous, and you guys were reading the Theaetetus dialogue, and this comes up in many dialogues, of Plato's demonstration of recollection. Because if teaching is something which is not simply telling a student what to memorize, but rather asking questions whereby the student can come to their own discovery on their own terms, or a student without a teacher, right? If you can have a dialectic internally with yourself as you explore that which you have never experienced before and make a discovery, like a eureka, ahaha, well, that means you've recognized something that you determine as a eureka, is what you were seeking, that was already there in your soul. You're like, aha, that's what I was looking for. But then how is that possible if you've never experienced the discovery? That's why it's a discovery, because you haven't made it before, right? So there must be something already there that recognizes the external undiscovered universe that was already there in some way inside of you. If so, where did that come from? Now, the question of, was it a past life that'll be explored, or is it something else? It doesn't necessarily have to be reincarnation, but that's the hypothesis that he's moving on right now. So let's see where it goes. But I hope did that kind of clarify the equality discussion a bit?
It certainly made additional sense to me. Thank you.
Cool.
Yeah. Can I try to put that in my own words and see if you agree, or see if I'm on the right track? So it's almost like just recognizing our ability to distinguish one thing from another, or to judge one thing as less than another, is showing that somehow inside of us previously we were in contact with, I want to say, perfection. And that's how we recognize that this is less than.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Maybe I would like to introduce a small distinction. Okay. I say that I'm not a fan of Kant because his critique of the practical reason is not extraordinary, but his critique of the pure reason about the a priori categories of mind is not bad at all. Why do I say that? Because what Susie said is very interesting, because the fact that we have some a priori categories to judge a phenomenal reality For me, could be a very strong argument for the soul only if you take into account the upper part of the soul. Okay, beauty, goodness, and truth. It's what Susie said, if we're capable to recognize perfection or beauty. But for the lower part of the mind, meaning space, time, energy, matter, and so on, it could be very easily answered that those categories are inbuilt in the structure of the body and the brain. So that's all for my small distinction.
I got a kind of a, I don't know what you'd call it, a paradox. You're talking about qualities, comparing qualities, and but in a quantity kind of a way.
Yes, absolutely. Because once
It's kind of
again,
funny. It's like somewhere in the past, I'm thinking like it's, you know, saying it's quality, not quantity, and here we are talking about quality and putting a quantity to the quality.
yes, but let's not forget that we are both. We are both. When you are speaking of the layers 1, 2, 3 of the mind, it's quantity. Okay, it's the what question. And when you're speaking of the layers 4, 5, 6
Yeah.
of the minds, it's the why question, it's the quality question.
Just find it funny. It's a play
Yes,
on words.
yes, we are both time and timelessness, and that is the ultimate paradox that is in us.
Oh, but Quan, what you said a paragraph or two ago, I wish you could say it again, because I don't know as I ever got to look at it in that way before, but the body itself relates to time,
Yes,
but the
yes,
higher functions of the soul relate to timelessness.
absolutely. And that is the ultimate paradox of our reality.
Well, I was thinking a little bit.
If you, I would take a risk to venture myself in the theological field. Okay, when in theology they say that Jesus Christ is 100% man and 100% God, that is the Christian answer to that question. Okay, we 100% time and 100% timelessness. We both.
Interesting.
I'll just add that it seems to me that on that question of quantity versus quality, that the implication that I understood was that the ability to judge both quality and quantity in determining inequality, because there's aspects of quality and quantity in those judgments, that is an a priori knowledge that may be coming from the soul or from the higher mind.
Yeah, well, only for the quality dimension, because nowadays we know enough neurobiology. Because if you have an atheist, okay, if you don't make the distinction, he would say, well, your famous a priori categories for passing judgment and phenomenal reality can be very easily explained by the structure of the body and of the mind, okay? And we don't have to resort to the soul. But it's only when you have to take into account the judgment of the qualities such as beauty, goodness, and truth or perfection. That's why I reacted to Susie's command, because she was talking about judgment of perfection. There you can have a stronger ground for a demonstration, an intellectual demonstration of the existence of the soul, because ultimately those intellectual demonstration can only come nearer asymptotically to that demonstration, but the true demonstration is by leaving your being. But I think that what is presented in the Phaedo are probably the best intellectual arguments that we can offer.
Matt, do you mind just explaining how we got from the previous discussion of opposites, living versus dying, etc., to this discussion about equality and just the logical, because I'm missing a link there.
Well, in this case, he's pursuing a hypothesis. And keep in mind, this is not the only hypothesis, because we're looking at certain effects of, well, the main question is, why should the true philosopher look forward, should look forward to being liberated from the shackles of the body, right? So death is defined in a very unique way. It's not the extinguishment of existence, which is how most people presume it to be, which is something to be feared. But he's redefining it, reframing it around something, around liberation, that your soul is being liberated from the body, which is already, it creates a new space to move in mentally, right? And part of this then becomes the question of like, okay, well, is there evidence that there is such a thing as a soul? Does it have power? What is its nature? Does it have intrinsic wisdom or some form of wisdom and power beyond the limits of our mortal coils? How could we pursue it? So one is this idea of cycles, because he's got this idea of cycles or linear experience, and he's like, well, if everything was just moving in a linear way in the universe, yeah, you'd have sort of like entropy. It's like this is like the essence of why entropy is insane, because entropy is just, it's like the Darwinian unidirectional homogenization of existence, as though the stronger gobble up the weaker, and you should be seeing in time less complexity, more homogeneity, which is what you get with globalization, which is basically the material expression of entropy, right? A system that is closed, that just can do nothing but move towards blah, heat death. Now that's sort of what you get, if people just, if all being that exists has a limited amount of energy in the universe, and when you go to sleep, you thus don't wake up. When you die, there's no reciprocal life to replenish the death. You would end up in a universe of death at some point. Now he's saying, well, no, let's observe that opposites tend to first of all exist, and if you get weaker, well, you got weaker because you were stronger, right? And if you just got shorter, well, you got shorter because at some point you were taller. So he's creating again, there's a certain playfulness here you got to keep in mind, but he's training the mind to just think about how more and less quantitative ideas help us judge qualitative phenomenon in some ways, but it's not. But is that the only pathway to it? That he's not answering that question. He's just giving us tools. But then, he then slips in certain things like, well, would we not say that worse is the opposite of better, right? As a state, would we not say that sleep is the opposite of awake? What about life? Is that not the opposite of death? But then the question is it right to is it necessarily the case that awake comes after a sleep? Yes, it is. That's pretty obvious, and vice versa. And could it also be the case that life emerges out of death, and that death emerges out of life in that same way? Maybe it is.
Yeah, we don't know that.
We don't know that yet.
Yeah.
That's not proven. But he's pursuing that. So part of that pursuit involves now the question of the soul existing before we lived in this body, and what evidence that might involve. And so the question of, well, the idea of equality, or let's say justice, like you can determine when an action in the material world is more or less just, which allows us to be inflamed with a sense of anger when we see injustice, and we're provoked to act to stop injustice, or, fight to correct it. So, we have this, but where did the justice come from? We weren't seeing pure justice in its pure state. We were seeing actions in the material domain that were more or less participating in that justice. So where did that justice come from? Where did we get that knowledge of the justice? Were we taught that when we were a baby? At what point, what about the equality? Is it just by seeing things that look equal that gives us the sense of equality, or is it something that was already there? So I guess that whole discussion is touching on that.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm about to post something in the chat that is related but unrelated, and it's a discussion on Forum Borealis with Cliff High about the nature of incarnation or reincarnation. It's a slightly different methodology because it certainly posits a different approach to what the soul is.
But Paul, I don't. I wouldn't necessarily go and bring in a whole bunch of other different ideas of reincarnation when we're really trying to figure out what is Plato actually trying to get at in the dialogue, right?
Okay.
I mean, I want you to share your opposing ideas if you've got different ideas.
No, it's not an opposing idea. It's
I
just
just
a
don't want-
discussion that is somewhat relevant. I sense that somewhere along the way here, there will be some mention, suggestion of reincarnation. I mean, how is it that we know certain things, when we learn something? Why is this recognition of knowledge? Where is it coming from?
Okay.
It's just a discussion about that. It's a fairly lengthy one, but it's an interesting one. It's based on Vedic ideas, not Platonic ideas.
Okay. All right. Yeah, sure. Share away.
Actually, Matt, I had read this from a different translation, and in that many years ago, and I recall he actually gives specific examples of reincarnation. If people have lived their lives in a violent way, they might end up being reincarnated as eagles or lions.
Oh, we're going to keep pursuing this. Yeah, this dialogue.
Does it come in this translation too, is my question. In this translation, does that same discussion come or no? I didn't read this.
Probably. It was recommended to me by somebody who's pretty wise. So I would imagine that they didn't iron that out of the conversation.
Okay. Because he gives very specific examples. He says, if you have lived your life in pursuit of the gods, as he calls them, you will arrive at the gods. Whereas if you have lived like an animal, you will end up with animals. You got a flavor of that when he talked about Hades, and if you haven't been perfected and initiated, you will fall to the mire. He gives a sort of a prelude or a preview of that idea. But whereas I don't know translation what follows later on. Yeah.
Whereas if you have, you'll be sitting alongside the gods.
Yeah, something like that.
But all those things we really don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. But we're studying what he said, the great mind said, basically.
Yeah.
Well, I think that this is one of the best exercises, and for me, this is a life-changing dialogue, and it should be read also with the apology and the credo in mind, since these were the last days of Socrates were written. Oh, and there was the other one before the apology. What is it? The Euthyphro. Euthyphro, exactly, on piety, that takes place a few hours before the actual trial itself, where Socrates now takes a stand and lays out his reasons for living the life the way he did, and puts his case out there into the public. And the credo is a debate whereby a character we already met, who told Socrates, hey, you better, the guards told me you should probably not talk, or else it could make your last minutes really painful, and you'll have to drink the poison a few times. And Socrates is like, yeah, don't worry about it. Let's do it twice or three times if we need to drink it that many times. But that's Credo, and Credo's an older supporter, but a very weaker, soul, who's a nice guy, and he just really wants to help Socrates out, who he really likes. And he's like, I bribed the guards. They're going to look the other way. I got a carriage for you to go to Syracuse. You could live out your life in comfort. I got you set up in a villa. Don't worry about it. Just come on. And they have a dialogue of whether it's better that Socrates go and escape with Credo, or whether he stay here and submit to the will of the demos. And he chooses to do what he does. So that's counterintuitive for many people who would think, like, what a stupid person. He could have kept on living his life and he could have had dialogues, in Syracuse. Why did he do that? So that's a really worthwhile debate or discussion. And then there's this, what we're reading right now. And like I said, I had always been led to believe that questions of the soul were really reserved for pure blind faith, and the intellect couldn't trespass into that domain. And Plato is just demonstrating that if you do it in a certain way, that's not what a computer does. Like, right? If you let go of computer logic and use human reason, you can actually move in this space, which starts sort of bridging the divide between the finite and the infinite, the divine and the mortal, in an impure way, but still a truthful way, which is nice. So whether or not all of the conclusions are necessarily the truth, well, by definition of what Socrates is doing, no, it's not the truth, but it's a demonstration of how this muscle works. And that process is really the key.
Yeah.
But
And-
it's also
and-
really cool what you were saying about, I'm sorry. But what you
Go-
were saying
go-
about, his friend was telling him you're not supposed to talk, or else you might have to drink the poison a couple of times. And him saying, no, don't worry about that. It's like he's not going to waste a moment of this experience, but he's going to allow everyone around him to glean as much from it as possible also. I think that is cool.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other subject of the FT throw, or maybe because most of the time the FT throw is considered as a dialogue on piety, it's not wrong, but it's much more a dialogue on holiness, okay? And holiness in the sense of to be whole, HWHOLE. So to be whole precisely is to have all your layers of the mind. And if you have all your layers of your mind, you should touch to that ultimate layer of the soul precisely.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's also a hilarious dialogue. On top of it being super profound.
Yes.
It's pretty funny.
Yeah. The story
Well-
behind it, how Euthyphro's father, like, what did he like left the guy out there, and it's like now he's trying to figure out if he should defend his father or not.
Yeah, because he's going to condemn his father, who might get the death penalty for killing one of his slaves, which is illegal. And Socrates is like, "Whoa, that's pretty serious stuff there. Your father must have done something really bad to the slave, and that slave must have done something must have been really innocent." And Euthyphro was like, "Well, I mean, the slave is not a perfect guy. He did kill another slave, and my father got really angry and tied him up and threw him in a ditch. But by the time he went to go to the town to get a police officer, but by the time they got back, the guy he'd froze to death." And Socrates is like, "Well, that is still pretty bad, but are you sure you want to kill your dad? Is that really?" And he's like, "Yes, the gods say that when you kill a slave, you should pay the repercussions of justice." And he's got his whole theory of what the gods want him to do, and he sees himself as a self-righteous instrument of God, or one of the gods that he likes a lot. And the dialogue he's like, "Okay, let's pull on that. Let's test that out a little bit," says Socrates. "Let's see where this goes." It's worthwhile.
Just make a comment about a statement made by Kelly, which seemed to me he's posing his natural objection to the idea of reincarnation. I just want to make a comment about that. First of all, I think before Christianity, reincarnation was widely believed among the Greeks and the Romans, as is evident from Socrates' discussion. But I'll come to now something in the gospel which I think was a key statement, which may have been the termination of the reincarnation belief. There is this statement where Jesus says, "Build not your treasure in this world where rust and moth corrupt, and thieves may break in and steal." And then he says, "For wherever thy treasure is, that's where thy heart will be." And it's my speculation that there was an additional line which was censored out by the Council of Nicaea, which would have logically said, "For wherever thy heart is, that's where you will end up." So if your heart is in this physical world, how can you arise to another world? It would be the logical conclusion, but in my opinion, it's just a speculation. This happened 1700 years ago. That line was probably censored out. But there's the link in the gospel to the notion of reincarnation, if you follow the logic of what was said. I'll just leave that as a thought. But aside from that, this dialogue is you don't have to agree with his conclusions. It's just familiarizing yourself with the thinking process and the arguments, and then everybody makes their own conclusions, right? There's no.
Well, that's what I love about this, and we're going to continue this. And by the way, I'm going to ask somebody to volunteer to recap next week. I know Kwan got everyone into the habit of doing that, which is excellent. It's a great mental exercise. So before we end tonight, someone has to volunteer. But what's great is that there's it's process oriented. So it isn't necessarily the case that the only solution to the question of the immortality of the soul be a matter of reincarnation, although that is a viable hypothesis that has to be explored and pursued, which is what he's going to be doing throughout the course of this thing. And we can continuously discuss to see what else could be, said that wasn't said or what have you, in the proof that he's going to lay out, because he's laying out a proof, a hypothesis, and challenging all future generations to continue to wrestle with this, to perfect it, whatever they want to do, or prove it wrong.
The linkage to that, Matt, sorry to interrupt, the linkage between this idea of reincarnation, which he explores, to what he has said earlier about the living arising from the dead, and the dead, from the living, is the living, the dead souls may come back to life, but in what state will they come back? And that will depend on how they have lived, I think. And that's his argument also, which he describes in detail. So that's where he goes into detail on if you have lived like a beast, you will end up as a beast, whereas if you have lived like a high person, you will end up with a god. He makes these, like your actions will determine where you end up, even when you come back. So whether that's that's the kind of logical relationship with the idea of reincarnation. Now, nobody has to accept it. It's what he says.
Well, definitely, it's not inconsequential how you live your life, in terms of the effects on your soul.
In fact, the Christian prophet has said, "You reap what you sow," right? So,
yeah. So, who wants to be the volunteer for next week? All you got to do is recap the first 15 pages of arguments. Now, you don't have to do it perfectly, but the essential kernel of the idea. So let's say if there's somebody new, they would at least get the gist of what, where we're at.
I'll apologize in advance. I might not be here next week.
No worries. Brandy, you want to give it a shot?
Okay, I'll give it a shot.
Sweet. All right. All right. Okay, guys, always an edifying, soulful pleasure, and looking forward to next week.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Good night.
Have a good night, everybody.
See you next week, possibly.
Possibly next week.
Yes.
Cheerio.
Thank you.
Good night. Bye-bye. Thank you.